hills of 1830s Kentucky, where fields of tobacco stretched to the horizon and log cabins stood in quiet clusters. A story took root that would unsettle even the most hardened of frontier families. It was whispered first in kitchens, then carried by wagon riders, until it became the kind of tale that caused even passing strangers to stop and listen. Two sisters, bound by blood, chose to share not just a household, not just their childhood memories, but one husband. And what began as an arrangement justified by necessity and survival grew into a shadow that lingered for generations. The year was 1836, a time when Kentucky was still shaping its identity between wilderness and statehood, between the old world's traditions and the young republic's moral codes. Communities were tight-knit, churches dictated much of daily life, and families often lived isolated miles apart. In such places, rumors were not mere gossip. They were lifelines of information, warnings, and judgments that shaped reputations. So when word spread that the Turner sisters, Sarah and Margaret, had both sworn themselves to one man, Elias Whitcomb, the whispers did not fade with time. They grew sharper, heavier, weighted with suspicion and unease. Elias himself was not extraordinary. A farmer in his mid-30s, quiet, broad-shouldered, a man known for his persistence more than his charm. But to the Turners, he was stability. Sarah, the elder sister, had married him first, fulfilling the expectation placed upon her by parents eager to secure land and alliance. Margaret, the younger, had watched from the edges of the ceremony, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. Yet within months, she too moved into the Whitcomb cabin, not as a guest, but as a wife in all but name. Neighbors told themselves it must be temporary. Perhaps Elias was merely offering protection to a sister left without prospects. Perhaps Margaret would soon marry another man and leave the household. But seasons passed, and she remained. The sisters worked side by side, cooked at the same hearth, slept in the same cabin. And when children began to arrive, first Sarah's, then Margaret's, no one outside the walls could say with certainty which children belonged to which mother. To outsiders, this was not just unusual, it was unnatural. The details of how such an arrangement began were never recorded in court papers or church records. There was no law in Kentucky at the time that neatly described what the Whitcombs had done. Polygamy was spoken of as a sin, something whispered about in distant Utah territories, not in respectable Baptist communities of the South. And yet here it was, on their own soil. Some neighbors recoiled in disgust, others in fascination. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of abominations against God's design. Children were warned not to wander near the Whitcomb land. But no one could deny that the sisters seemed untroubled by the storm of judgment around them. If anything, their calm acceptance of the arrangement unsettled people more. Yet behind the calm exterior, strange details crept into the narrative. A midwife who visited the cabin swore she heard the sisters whispering in a language she did not understand. A neighbor claimed that one night, passing by on horseback, he saw only one shadow moving inside, though both women were said to be home. Another man insisted that Elias, once hearty and talkative, grew pale and gaunt over the years, as though drained of something unseen. These fragments fed the unease. They turned a scandal into something darker, something folkloric. People began to call the Whitcomb cabin the House of Divided Vows, a place where family bonds and sacred promises twisted into something unholy. By the 1840s, when newcomers asked about the land, locals would shake their heads and mutter, "That's where the sisters lived with one husband," as though the words themselves carried a curse. But what frightened people most was not the arrangement itself, strange as it was. It was the silence. The sisters never defended themselves, never explained their decision. They lived as if the world beyond their cabin mattered little, as if they had built their own reality within those walls. Silence in that context became more damning than words. It suggested knowledge they would not share, choices rooted in secrets no one dared to uncover. The mystery deepened when Elias died under ambiguous circumstances. Some said illness carried him off. Others whispered that the sisters had done something to hasten his decline. His funeral was sparsely attended, the church reluctant to host the service. After his burial, Sarah and Margaret continued to live together in the cabin, raising their children as though nothing had changed. If anything, their bond seemed stronger, the line between their identities more blurred. By then, fear had transformed into superstition. Locals spoke of seeing the sisters walking at dusk, their figures so alike that one could not tell them apart. Some swore they heard laughter echoing from the cabin at strange hours, though no visitors ever came calling. And when a child went missing in the neighboring woods one winter, there were those who immediately cast suspicion toward the Whitcombs. Though no evidence was ever found, the story of the Turner sisters is not a simple tale of scandal or sin. It is a story about how a community reacts when boundaries of morality blur, when silence and secrecy feed the imagination, and when ordinary lives begin to feel like part of something otherworldly. In 1836, one household in Kentucky became more than just a curiosity. It became a wound, a riddle, and for some, a haunting. And so the story begins, not with answers, but with questions that have lingered through generations. Who were these sisters truly? What held them together in defiance of law, faith, and public scorn? And what shadows grew inside their cabin, hidden from the world but powerful enough to shape their legacy into something dark, something unforgettable? To understand the strange and unsettling story of the Turner sisters and the husband they shared, one must step back into the broader world of Kentucky in the early 19th century. It was a society balanced uneasily between frontier survival and the moral codes imported from Europe, a place where the demands of daily labor often collided with rigid expectations of faith and family. Kentucky in the 1830s was no longer raw wilderness, but neither was it a fully settled and orderly society. The state had joined the Union in 1792, but much of its culture remained shaped by its frontier beginnings. Farms were carved out of forest clearings, cabins built by hand from rough-hewn logs, and communities were often spread thin, separated by miles of rolling farmland or winding rivers. Social life was anchored in the family unit, the church, and the marketplace, yet each existed under the weight of survival. Disease, poor harvests, and accidents claimed lives quickly. Widows and orphans were common. Remarriage was not just a choice, but a necessity for survival. In such a world, family bonds were considered sacred, but they were also flexible in ways modern readers may struggle to grasp. Cousins often married cousins. Arranged marriages were common, forged as much by land, inheritance, and survival as by affection. Age differences between husbands and wives could be extreme. In many communities, what mattered most was not whether a union was romantic, but whether it kept families secure and farms running. Religion, however, set boundaries. Kentucky was saturated with the fervor of the Second Great Awakening, a religious revival that swept across America in the early 1800s. Preachers thundered in camp meetings, warning settlers about sin, salvation, and the dangers of straying from God's design. Among Baptists and Methodists, who dominated the region, marriage was seen as sacred, monogamous, and deeply tied to moral order. To deviate from this was to risk not only community disapproval, but also the suggestion of damnation. Against this backdrop, the story of Sarah and Margaret Turner becomes even more provocative. Sisters sharing one husband was not just unusual, it directly challenged the religious and cultural order of the time. For many neighbors, it would have echoed the biblical language of abomination and iniquity, terms preachers used liberally from pulpits. And yet, to others, it may have carried a darker fascination. In a society where women often had little power over their own futures, here were two sisters who seemed to have carved their own path, however scandalous. The lives of women in 1830s Kentucky were not easy. From childhood, they were trained to cook, spin, sew, and manage households. Once married, they bore children frequently, often in dangerous conditions without access to trained medical care. Death in childbirth was a constant fear. Many women found themselves widowed by their 20s or 30s, left to raise children with limited means. The Turner sisters, like many of their generation, lived under these shadows. To choose to remain together, sharing not only a household but a husband, may have offered them strength against the brutal unpredictability of life. At the same time, Kentucky's legal system and cultural norms left little space for such arrangements. Polygamy was not formally codified as a crime in most southern states, because it was considered unthinkable. The idea of two sisters sharing one man fell into a void of legality. Condemned by preachers, shunned by neighbors, yet not easily prosecuted in courts. This legal ambiguity gave the Turner household a strange form of protection. They were outside the bounds of acceptance, yet beyond the reach of law. It is worth noting that such arrangements, though shocking to neighbors, were not without precedent in human history. Across the globe, some cultures had practiced polyandry or polygyny as survival strategies. In rural Kentucky, where isolation and hardship often forced families into unconventional choices, whispers of strange households occasionally surfaced. Yet few left as deep a mark on local memory as the Turner sisters. Culturally, the Turners' story reveals the tensions of an America still defining itself. On the one hand, it was a land that prided itself on freedom and individuality. On the other, it demanded conformity to strict moral codes, especially in matters of sex and marriage. To break those codes was to invite suspicion, rumor, and often violence. The Whitcomb household stood at that fault line, a family unit that defied convention, and in doing so became a symbol of unease. Beyond the boundaries of their farm, the larger world of 1830s America was shifting dramatically. The country was expanding westward, fueled by dreams of land and opportunity. The Cherokee were being forced from their homelands in the Trail of Tears, a reminder that progress often carried violence in its shadow. Slavery still thrived in Kentucky, a reality that shaped every social and economic interaction, even for families like the Turners who may not have owned slaves themselves. The story of two sisters sharing one husband must be read against this backdrop of instability and moral conflict. A society willing to tolerate the cruelty of bondage found itself unable to tolerate a household that quietly defied marital tradition. Daily life in rural Kentucky also carried an undercurrent of superstition. Folklore and faith often blended seamlessly. Families told stories of witches, curses, and ghosts. Natural disasters were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. Against this cultural fabric, the Whitcomb arrangement would not have been viewed merely as scandalous. It may have been seen as dangerous, as a possible invitation for curses or divine wrath. The silence of the sisters, their refusal to explain themselves, only deepened the sense of something uncanny. Social isolation made matters worse. With neighbors spread far apart, rumors could grow unchecked, fed by fear and imagination. A single odd event, a child going missing, a crop failing, could be linked to the Turners in people's minds. The sisters became not just unusual women, but symbols of a moral danger that threatened the wider community. Thus, the historical setting of the Turner sisters' story is one of contradiction. A frontier society that valued independence yet demanded conformity. A land of survival where unusual arrangements might make sense, yet where religion condemned them. A culture that tolerated immense cruelty in some forms, yet recoiled in horror at deviations in family structure. The story of Sarah and Margaret is more than a scandal. It is a window into the deep anxieties of 19th century America, anxieties about gender, morality, survival, and the boundaries of the human family. As the decades passed, the sisters' story lingered in memory not just because of what they did, but because of what it revealed. It showed how fragile the line was between acceptance and exile, between a household considered respectable and one cast into folklore. In the end, the Turner sisters lived at the very heart of that contradiction, embodying a tension that has never fully disappeared from American culture. The story of the Turner sisters cannot be told without speaking of the strange episodes that surrounded their household, moments that blurred the line between ordinary misfortune and something darker. It was not only the scandal of their shared husband that drew whispers, but the accumulation of incidents, each one small on its own, but together forming a pattern that neighbors could not ignore. The first incident recorded in memory occurred one summer evening in 1837. Just a year after Margaret moved into the Whitcomb cabin, Elias was plowing the field when the horse bolted unexpectedly, throwing him into a ditch. He emerged battered with a gash across his forehead, his plow broken in two. Witnesses claimed they saw the sisters standing by the fence line, calm and silent, watching as though expecting the accident before it occurred. When neighbors asked why they had not run to help, Sarah replied softly, "He must bear what was given." It was a strange answer, and though Elias survived, he carried a scar down his temple that never faded. Months later, another event deepened suspicion. A young farmhand from a nearby property came to help with the harvest. He was strong, cheerful, and popular among the other men. Yet after only 3 weeks, he fell mysteriously ill. His skin grew pale, his voice weak, his body trembling as though drained of energy. His family accused the Whitcombs of working him too hard, but others whispered that the boy had been touched by the sisters. One midwife swore she found peculiar marks on his chest, as if pressed by fingers too tightly. The boy died within days. Though no evidence tied the sisters to his decline, the timing and the secrecy of their household left the community uneasy. By 1839, Elias himself began to weaken. Neighbors who remembered him as broad and sturdy now saw a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and restless eyes. Some said he staggered when he walked, as though his legs barely obeyed him. Others noticed the way he avoided speaking, letting the sisters answer on his behalf. Rumor spread that his will had been broken, not by illness but by something more insidious, the quiet dominance of the sisters who shared his bed. That winter, a violent incident confirmed the worst fears of the community. A storm swept across the hills, and a large oak collapsed onto the roof of the Whitcomb cabin. Neighbors rushed through the sleet to help, fearing the family trapped inside. What they found unsettled them. The roof shattered, the hearth fire extinguished, and Elias lying in the corner struck across the chest by falling beams. Yet the sisters stood unscathed, their clothes neat, their hair dry despite the storm. Sarah simply said, "The house has given him back to the earth." Elias recovered slowly, but whispers grew. Why had the house fallen only where he slept? Why were the sisters untouched? The pattern deepened with smaller, stranger details. Travelers passing the property swore they saw only one sister at a time, though both were known to live there. Some claimed that when they spoke, it was as though one voice carried through two mouths, sentences finishing seamlessly between them. A school teacher who delivered supplies to the children once remarked that he could not tell the siblings apart. Their mannerisms so perfectly mirrored that it seemed they were reflections rather than individuals. Then came the knife. In 1841, Elias was found at the edge of the woods, bleeding from a deep cut along his thigh. He claimed he had fallen while chopping firewood, but the wound looked more deliberate than accidental. When the doctor stitched him, Elias would not meet his gaze, repeating only, "The blade slipped." The doctor left shaken, certain he had treated a wound inflicted by another hand. Yet Elias refused to speak, and the sisters offered no explanation. As the years stretched on, misfortune clung to the Whitcomb land. Crops failed unexpectedly, blight spreading through fields while neighbors' farms flourished. A barn caught fire without clear cause, its flames rising high enough to be seen miles away. The family lost nearly all their stores that year, but when neighbors offered help, the sisters declined. Margaret reportedly told one woman, "We need nothing but what is ours." Such refusals added to the air of isolation, as though the sisters were deliberately cutting themselves away from the community. But the darkest event came in 1843, when one of the Whitcomb children, a boy of 6, vanished from the yard. Sarah insisted he had wandered into the woods and been lost to the river. Search parties scoured the hills for 3 days, finding no trace. On the 4th day, a hunter stumbled across the child's shoe, neatly placed on a tree stump, its laces tied in a bow. The boy was never seen again. Some whispered that the sisters had offered him up in some secret ritual. Others believed he had simply drowned. Yet the calmness with which Sarah and Margaret accepted his disappearance chilled even those inclined to sympathy. "He is with us still," Margaret said cryptically, "just not as before." After that, the household's reputation sank fully into darkness. The local church refused to accept them as members. Neighbors stopped trading with them. Children were warned to keep away. Stories circulated of chanting heard at night, of lights flickering in the cabin long after the lamps should have been extinguished. Some swore that when they passed by at dusk, they saw Elias's face in the window, hollow, distant, and pleading silently for release. By 1845, Elias was dead. The cause was officially listed as fever, but those who saw his body claimed his skin bore unusual bruises, round and patterned like marks left by hands. His funeral was meager, conducted quietly without a preacher's blessing. The sisters remained together, raising the surviving children and tending the land. Their silence in the face of rumor became its own form of accusation, a refusal that left imaginations free to paint the darkest possible picture. More incidents followed. A neighbor's livestock were found mutilated, their throats cut with precision. A child's doll appeared on a fence post outside the Whitcomb property, its eyes burned black. A woman who confronted the sisters claimed her husband fell ill within the week, coughing until blood stained his pillow. The more the community turned against them, the more each misfortune in the county was laid at their door. Whether guilty or innocent, the sisters had become vessels for fear. By the 1850s, the Whitcomb cabin was spoken of in whispers only. Travelers avoided the road that passed near it. Some said the sisters never aged, that they looked the same as they had 20 years earlier. Others claimed they had fused into one presence, indistinguishable, a pair of figures who moved and spoke as a single being. When Sarah died, or perhaps Margaret, depending on which account one reads, there was no grave marker. The body was buried in the woods by the surviving sister, who continued on alone. Which sister remained was never clear, and so the incidents became legend. Each story layered upon the last until truth and superstition could no longer be separated. What began as an unusual marriage had evolved into a narrative of misfortune, blood, and whispered curses. The sisters themselves said nothing, left no written record, and offered no defense. Silence was their weapon, and silence was what condemned them. The community around them continued to grow, new families moving in, old ones moving away. Yet the story of the Turner sisters lingered. Parents warned their children, never stray near the old Whitcomb land. Farmers crossed themselves when they saw smoke rising from its chimney. And when the last of the sisters vanished from record, no death date, no burial, the absence itself became the final, most haunting incident of all. For more than a century, the land was considered tainted. Few dared to build there. Hunters who strayed too close swore they heard laughter in the woods, or caught sight of two pale figures at the edge of their vision, vanishing when approached. Even today, fragments of the story survive, passed down in hushed tones, as proof that not all mysteries fade with time. The incidents of the Turner sisters are not merely accidents and misfortunes. They are the bones of folklore, the raw material of fear. Together they form a chain that binds history to haunting, leaving us with a question: were these women victims of rumor and isolation, or did something within their household invite the darkness that surrounded them? The story of the Turner sisters cannot be understood without examining how the community around them reacted. In many ways, the incidents that unfolded within their cabin became less important than the shadows they cast upon neighbors, pastors, physicians, and the fragile social fabric of rural Kentucky in the 1830s and 1840s. It is in those reactions that we glimpse both the terror of the unknown and the power of rumor. At first, the townsfolk viewed the arrangement with cautious curiosity. Polygamy, though not entirely unheard of in whispers about frontier settlements, was a scandalous violation of Christian norms in Kentucky. Pastors thundered from pulpits that one man and one woman was the only union permitted by Scripture. Yet Elias, Sarah, and Margaret seemed to live quietly enough, working their fields and tending their children. For a time, curiosity outweighed condemnation. People gossiped, but they still traded goods, borrowed tools, and accepted the Whitcombs as eccentric neighbors. That tolerance eroded with each unexplained misfortune. When Elias appeared with strange wounds, when a child disappeared, when livestock died mysteriously, the whispers hardened into fear. Farmers began crossing themselves when they passed the Whitcomb property. Some muttered that the sisters practiced charms, old country spells drawn from forgotten European folk traditions. Others said it was punishment from God for their sinful household. The church became the loudest voice against them. Reverend Hollis, a stern figure with piercing eyes, denounced the sisters in his sermons. He warned that their presence brought blight and pestilence, that their refusal to repent would invite divine wrath upon the entire valley. Congregants nodded grimly, though not all were convinced. Still, the stigma grew. When the Whitcombs arrived at service, the pew around them remained empty. Children were pulled away from their own children during Sunday gatherings. Isolation deepened, feeding the sense of otherness. Doctors and midwives, too, recorded their own suspicions. A physician who treated Elias's wounds noted in his journal that the sisters answered every question for him, their voices calm while his eyes darted nervously. It was as though his will had been stripped away, the doctor wrote. He seemed less a husband than a captive. A midwife recalled a chilling experience, called to the cabin for a birth. She claimed the sisters whispered together in the corner while she worked, their words unintelligible but rhythmic, almost chant-like. Whether it was prayer, superstition, or something else entirely, she could not say, but the impression lingered, and she never returned. Neighbors' reactions revealed the fragile psychology of the era. In the absence of clear explanations, the human mind reached for supernatural causes. A child vanishes? It must be witchcraft. A barn fire breaks out? A curse. Crops fail in one field but not another? Evidence of divine punishment. In a community where faith governed daily life and science was a fledgling authority, misfortune rarely remained random. It demanded meaning, and the sisters became the vessel for that meaning. Newspapers, too, began to play their role. The Lexington Gazette published a short piece in 1843 describing a most peculiar domestic arrangement in the hills of Kentucky, where two sisters are said to share not only a household, but a husband. The tone was mocking, sensationalist, designed to titillate readers in distant towns. Yet between the lines was an undercurrent of unease. Reports of Elias's failing health, of unexplained illness among hired hands, of the child's disappearance. In an age hungry for moral cautionary tales, the Whitcombs became a convenient example of what happens when people defy convention. As time went on, fear hardened into hostility. Neighbors who once traded eggs or shared tools now shunned the sisters entirely. They were excluded from quilting circles, market gatherings, even funerals. No one wanted to be associated with them. When their barn caught fire, few men came to help extinguish the flames. One neighbor later admitted he believed it was God's judgment, and that to intervene would be to interfere with divine will. Yet not all reactions were hateful. Some expressed quiet pity. A widow named Eliza told her daughter that the sisters looked tired beyond their years, and that their silence was perhaps not guilt, but grief. A schoolteacher confided to his diary that he suspected the stories were exaggerations, fueled by fear of difference. He noted how quickly gossip transformed small misfortunes into grand curses. But these sympathetic voices were drowned beneath the louder chorus of condemnation. By the time Elias died, the reaction was one of grim inevitability. Some claimed relief that the man had finally been freed from his unnatural life. Others whispered that his death marked the beginning of darker times, as the sisters were now bound to no earthly restraint. The funeral was sparsely attended. No preacher presided. The coffin was lowered in silence, watched only by the sisters, their children, and a handful of wary neighbors who came more from curiosity than compassion. In the years that followed, the reaction shifted again. As the sisters withdrew further into isolation, their silence allowed myth to expand unchecked. Fear became folklore. Parents told their children to stay away, not because of proven danger, but because the story had taken root in their minds. The sisters were cursed, perhaps witches, perhaps worse. The human instinct to protect by warning meant the legend perpetuated itself. Psychologists today might call it a case of collective projection, a community funneling its anxieties, its hardships, and its sense of vulnerability onto a single household. Social historians might frame it as the punishment of women who defied gender and marital norms. Anthropologists could read it as a classic example of scapegoating, where unusual families become the repository of communal fear. But to those who lived through it, it was simpler. Misfortune followed the Turner sisters, and misfortune must have a cause. Even decades later, when the cabin was empty and the sisters gone, reactions persisted. Travelers reported chills when they passed the land. Locals refused to purchase or till the soil, convinced it remained cursed. Old men retold the story in taverns as proof of God's justice. Children dared one another to walk the boundary fence at dusk, but none stepped inside. The sisters had vanished, but the reaction of the community ensured they would never truly disappear. Their silence became legend, and the legend became fear passed from one generation to the next. The summer of 1847 was dry and airless, the kind of season when dust hung motionless in the heat and every creak of timber echoed like a warning. By then, Elias had been in his grave nearly a decade, and the Turner sisters lived alone with their children in the cabin at the edge of the valley. To most, they had become ghosts while still alive, figures glimpsed in windows, shadows moving through fields at dusk. Yet the climax of their story came not in the quiet of their seclusion, but in one night when silence turned against them. It began with the sound of crying, thin, piercing, inhuman. Neighbors swore it carried across the valley, though none could say from which direction it came. Dogs howled, cattle kicked against fences, and children woke trembling. Some insisted it was a fox's scream, others a newborn's wail. But those who listened closest said it came from the Whitcomb land, the sound spilling from the cabin where no one dared approach. Inside, the children of Sarah and Margaret later described the night in fragments. Candles guttered, though no wind stirred. The air turned heavy, thick as smoke. The sisters moved with unusual urgency, locking shutters, barring the door, whispering prayers that sounded unlike the hymns their neighbors knew. One child recalled how his mother pressed him to the floor, her hand clamped over his mouth, as if silence itself were the only protection they had left. What followed blurred the line between the natural and the supernatural. Witnesses in distant fields reported seeing lights flicker around the cabin, pale blue, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. Others claimed to hear voices, a chorus of women singing low and steady, broken only by a sudden scream that cut the night in two. One farmer, bold enough to ride closer, said he saw the sisters standing at the threshold, arms raised as though commanding the air itself. He turned back before reaching the fence, convinced he had intruded on something not meant for mortal eyes, and then, the silence. It was said the sound fell over the valley all at once, a silence so complete that even the insects ceased their endless drone. The cabin stood in darkness, every window black, the yard still as a grave. Hours passed. Dawn crept across the hills. But when neighbors finally gathered their courage to approach, they found the house abandoned. The door was unbarred. The hearth was cold. Dishes sat unfinished on the table. The sisters, their children, every soul was gone. The disappearance sent shockwaves through the valley. Some believed the sisters had fled, fearing violence from the community. Others swore the devil himself had come to collect his own. A preacher declared it proof of divine judgment. The women who defied God's order had been struck down, body and soul. Yet practical men found no tracks in the dust, no wagon ruts, no signs of hurried departure. It was as though they had simply dissolved into air. The cabin itself became a scene of terror. Those who entered claimed to feel watched, their skin pricking with unseen eyes. On the table lay a single object, a knife, driven point first into the wood, its handle wrapped in cloth stained dark. A Bible lay open beside it, though no one could agree on the page. Some swore it was Revelation, others Exodus. The words seemed to shift with each telling, as though the book itself resisted clarity. Over the following nights, the valley remained restless. Farmers swore their livestock refused to graze near the Whitcomb fence. Children dreamed of women calling their names in voices they both recognized and feared. The preacher refused to step inside the cabin, declaring it unfit for prayer. Yet still, men returned, drawn as if the mystery itself had become a kind of haunting. Each visit added to the lore, strange markings on the walls, ashes arranged in circles, whispers caught in the rafters. In time, the cabin was abandoned to rot, its logs softening under rain, its roof sagging into ruin. But the night of the sisters' vanishing remained burned into memory. Those who were children then grew old retelling it, swearing they still heard the cry that had begun it all. Whether human or animal, it had been the signal of an ending, a sound that pulled a whole family from the world and left only silence in their place. The climax of the Turner sisters' story is not a single act of violence, but the erasure of a household in one night. In that vanishing, fear found its sharpest edge. A community that had long whispered about curses and sin now had proof for what felt like it. The women who had defied convention, who had lived by their own rules, had been swallowed by a silence no one could explain. To this day, the tale of their disappearance clings to the Kentucky hills. Travelers speak of phantom lights on summer nights, of voices carried on the wind, of a cabin that appears and vanishes like a mirage. But to those who study the story, the climax remains the same, a night when fear and faith collided, when silence became louder than any scream, and when two sisters and their children stepped beyond the edge of history into legend. Years passed and the valley around the Turner homestead changed. Farms were bought and sold, new families settled in, churches were built and torn down, and the world marched steadily toward the modern age. But the cabin, what remained of it, stood as a husk of memory, a monument not to what was, but to what could never be explained. The story of Sarah and Margaret, the sisters who once shared a husband and later vanished with their children, did not fade with time. Instead, it settled into the soil like a seed of unease, sprouting in whispers and warnings. Some believed they had fled west, blending into another community under false names. The 1830s and 1840s were years of migration after all, when families packed their wagons and vanished into the promise of new land. To those with practical minds, this explanation felt most plausible. Yet even they stumbled when asked why no trace was ever found. No letters, no distant rumors, no descendants stepping forward generations later. The silence was too complete. Others leaned into the supernatural. They said the sisters had been claimed by forces they courted, whether by sin, witchcraft, or simply the wrath of God. Their vanishing was retold in the style of Scripture. The ground opened, the air swallowed, the valley cleansed. These stories served as moral warnings. Parents pointed to the Whitcomb place as proof of what happens when people stray from the order of family, when sisters share what is not meant to be shared. In this way, the mystery became not just history, but a cautionary tale, carved into the memory of Kentucky's hills. And then there were those who saw tragedy beneath the fear. They imagined two women trapped by circumstance, surviving in the only way they knew, punished for their defiance by the relentless judgment of neighbors. To them, the disappearance was not divine but human, perhaps a flight into secrecy, perhaps an end chosen in despair. The knife left in the table, the Bible splayed open, might have been symbols not of sorcery, but of a desperate plea for release. Modern scholars have tried to interpret the case through different lenses. Psychologists suggest the community projected its fears onto the sisters, scapegoating them for misfortunes that had nothing to do with their household. Historians frame it as an example of how rigid gender and religious norms punished those who lived differently. Folklorists see in the tale a pattern common to many cultures. Women who step outside their prescribed roles are remembered as witches, their lives rewritten as warnings for future generations. Each theory sheds light, but none dispels the darkness fully. The land itself seems to resist closure. Travelers report that no crops thrive where the cabin once stood. Hunters speak of a strange quiet that descends when they cross the property line, as though sound itself hesitates. Some claim to see two figures at dusk, standing side by side, watching without moving, their outlines blurred as though drawn in smoke. Skeptics dismiss such claims as tricks of light, but those who live nearby avoid the place after sundown. Fear, once planted, has a long half-life. What lingers most, however, is not terror but reflection. The Turner sisters force us to ask unsettling questions. How much of history is truth, and how much is the invention of frightened minds? Were Sarah and Margaret truly dangerous, or were they simply different, punished for living in a way the world refused to accept? Did they vanish by choice, or were they consumed by the very silence that seemed to follow them? No one can answer, and perhaps that is why their story endures. Mystery has a power that fact can never quite match. It leaves space for fear, for wonder, for speculation. In the case of the Turner sisters, the absence of answers became the strongest evidence of all. Today, when people pass through rural Kentucky and hear the story, they do not speak of dates or genealogies. They speak of silence, of the cry that began one terrible night, of the cabin left abandoned with dishes still on the table, of sisters who defied the world and in turn slipped beyond its reach. And in that silence lies the true horror, not screams, not violence, but the unanswered questions that stretch across centuries. Were they sinners, victims, or something altogether other? The ground holds its secrets, the air carries its whispers, and as long as the story is told, the sisters remain caught between history and legend, between fear and pity, between the world that judged them and the silence that claimed them. Perhaps they are still there, unseen, waiting. Perhaps silence is not absence, but presence in another form. A reminder that the past is never truly gone. It lingers patient in the spaces we dare not enter.